I'm Eleanor Mitchell, though everyone calls me Ellie. At 60, I've spent my entire career as a financial analyst, helping others secure their futures while carefully building my own. Rick and I met at Michigan State, married after graduation, and built what I thought was a solid life together in Lakeside, a charming town nestled against Cedar Lake. Our colonial-style house with its wraparound porch had been our dream, the culmination of years of hard work and disciplined saving. That evening, after overhearing Rick's call, I didn't confront him immediately. My Aunt Vivian, who raised me after my parents died, taught me that information is power, and hasty reactions often squander that power. Instead, I quietly retreated to our bedroom and pulled out my laptop, checking our joint accounts under the pretense of working on our tax preparation. The evidence was immediately clear. Over the past 18 months, Rick had systematically withdrawn nearly $400,000 from our retirement accounts. Small enough amounts to avoid triggering my immediate attention, but devastating in their totality. The money had been moved to an account I didn't recognize at First Capital Bank, an account that required both our signatures to establish, yet somehow existed without my knowledge. My fingers trembled over the keyboard as I dug deeper. There were regular transfers from this mysterious account to a name that turned my blood cold. Melissa Jenkins, Rick's former marketing assistant, 24 years his junior, who had left the company suddenly about 2 years ago. I had thought nothing of it at the time. Now the timing aligned perfectly with the first withdrawals from our retirement funds. I closed the laptop and took a deep breath, staring out at Cedar Lake through our bedroom window. The sunset painted the water in shades of gold and crimson, a beauty that contrasted sharply with the ugliness I had just discovered. Rick's betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was financial. He was funding a new life with our retirement savings, the money we had both worked decades to accumulate. Most women in my position would confront their husbands immediately, demand explanations, hire divorce attorneys. But I wasn't most women. And unlike Rick, I actually knew our complete financial situation. The next morning, I made Rick his favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes with real Michigan maple syrup, and kissed him goodbye as he left for his weekly golf game. His smile never faltered. His eyes never revealed the double life he was living. 35 years of marriage, and I realized I was looking at a stranger. Once his car disappeared down our tree-lined street, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Olivia Barnes, my college roommate, and now one of the most respected forensic accountants in the state. The second was to Daniel Wong, the attorney who had helped my Aunt Vivian establish the Mitchell Family Trust 15 years before she passed away. "Ellie, I was just thinking about you." Olivia's warm voice held genuine delight. "We tried to meet monthly for lunch, though lately Rick had been making excuses for why I needed to stay home." Another red flag I had missed. "I need your help, Liv," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Professionally, can you meet me today? It's urgent." 3 hours later, Olivia and I sat at her kitchen table at her lake house 20 miles. Outside of Lakeside, financial documents spread between us like battle plans. Her expression grew increasingly grave as I explained what I had discovered. "The systematic nature of these withdrawals is concerning," she said, her finger tracing the pattern of transactions. "This wasn't impulsive. He planned this carefully." "That's what hurts the most," I admitted, "the calculated nature of it." Olivia looked up, her eyes narrowing. "Have you checked your credit report? If he's been this thorough, he might have opened other accounts in your name." I hadn't considered that possibility. Olivia helped me pull my credit reports right there, and sure enough, 2 credit cards had been opened in my name within the last year, both carrying balances of over $30,000. Charges for jewelry, weekend, getaways, and restaurants I had never visited appeared on the statements. "Identity theft," Olivia stated flatly, "from your own husband." My meeting with Daniel Wong the following day brought a different kind of revelation. We met in his downtown office, the autumn sunlight streaming through tall windows as he pulled out a thick folder labeled Mitchell Trust. "Your Aunt Vivian was one of the shrewdest financial minds I've ever known," Daniel said, his voice carrying deep respect. "When she established this trust, she insisted on some unusual provisions. At the time, I thought they were overly cautious." He slid a document across his polished desk. The trust's protection clauses were highlighted in yellow. Complete separation from marital assets, fraud protection provisions, and most importantly, a clause that would immediately rescind any spousal benefits if the spouse attempted to access or control assets without proper authorization. "Did Rick ever try to access the trust?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Daniel nodded grimly. "3 times in the past 2 years. Each time he claimed you had sent him but couldn't. Provide the authentication codes. We denied access, of course, as per your instructions." I thought of Rick's increasing frustration about unnecessary financial complications and his suggestions that we should simplify our estate planning. He had been trying to get to money he didn't know I had, money that was protected by my aunt's foresight and my own caution. "There's something else," Daniel added, pulling out another file. "The trust owns your lake house property outright. Rick's name isn't on it, though I know he believes he's co-owner." This revelation struck me like physical blow. The lake house that Rick had been renovating for the past year, the justification for some of his extended absences, wasn't even his to renovate. Had he been taking Melissa there, planning to claim it somehow? That evening, I drove to our lake property unannounced. It was a small, charming cabin on Pinewood Lake that my aunt had left me, about an hour from our main home. As I pulled up the gravel driveway, I noticed unfamiliar curtains in the windows and a sleek sports car parked beside Rick's SUV. I didn't go in. I didn't need to see what was happening inside. Instead, I took photos of the vehicles, noted the time and date, and drove to the local hardware store where I purchased new locks and security cameras. I would return later, when they were gone. Over the next 2 weeks, I built my case methodically, meeting with Olivia and Daniel repeatedly. We documented every unauthorized withdrawal, every forged signature, every attempt to access my protected assets. I hired Thomas Reed, a cybersecurity specialist Olivia recommended, who recovered deleted emails and text messages from our home computer that revealed the full extent of Rick's plans. "He's planning to file for divorce in December," Thomas explained, showing me recovered message threads. He's been consulting with an attorney who specializes in hiding assets during high-net-worth divorces. What Rick didn't realize was that his attorney was fighting a battle that had already been lost. The assets he thought were available to claim had been protected long before he even conceived his plan. I also discovered something that turned my personal injury into something larger and more troubling. Rick and Melissa weren't acting alone. Thomas uncovered communications with 3 other couples, all older men with younger partners, discussing strategies for accessing retirement funds and circumventing financial safeguards put in place by their wives. "This is a pattern," Olivia confirmed when I shared this information. "I've seen it before. Targeting retirement-age women, particularly those who might not be managing the day-to-day finances despite having substantial assets." My Aunt Vivian's voice echoed in my memory. "Financial predation often happens closest to home, Ellie. That's why you must always maintain your independence, no matter how much you love someone." She had known. Perhaps not specifically about Rick, but she had recognized the vulnerability of women in my position. Her own husband had done something similar. Decades earlier, though she rarely spoke of it. Instead, she had channeled that experience into creating financial education programs for women and establishing trusts like mine that protected against exactly this kind of betrayal. It was time to honor her legacy by doing more than just protecting myself. With Olivia and Daniel's help, I developed a 3-part plan. First, secure all my assets and document the fraud. Second, confront Rick under controlled circumstances that would expose his scheme without allowing him to cause further damage. And third, perhaps most importantly, use this experience to help other women protect themselves from similar situations. The confrontation happened at the Lighthouse Restaurant, an upscale establishment overlooking Cedar Lake where Rick and I had celebrated numerous anniversaries. I had suggested meeting there to discuss our future plans, a phrase vague enough to pique his interest without raising suspicion. What Rick didn't know was that Olivia, Daniel, and Thomas were seated at nearby tables, and Sophia Rodriguez, the manager from First Capital Bank, where the fraudulent accounts had been established, was waiting in a private dining room with complete documentation of Rick's financial manipulations. Rick arrived 15 minutes late, looking slightly flustered but covering it with his practiced charm. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He kissed my cheek as he sat down, ordered his usual scotch, and launched into a story about a problem with his golf club membership. I let him talk, studying the face I had woken up to for 35 years. The subtle gray at his temples that I had once found distinguished now seemed like another deception. A mask of respectability covering something corrupt beneath. "Rick?" I finally interrupted, my voice calm. "I know about Melissa." His smile faltered only slightly. "Who?" "Melissa Jenkins, your former assistant. The woman you've been spending our retirement savings on for the past 2 years." Now the smile disappeared completely. His eyes darted around the restaurant, assessing who might be within earshot. "Ellie, this isn't the place. I also know about the credit cards you opened in my name. The lake house you've been renovating for her with money from our accounts. The divorce you're planning to file for in December, after you transfer the last of our accessible assets." The blood drained from his face. "How did you—" "The better question," I said, sliding a folder across the table, "is how did you think you would get away with it?" He opened the folder to find printouts of his own emails, bank statements showing the systematic withdrawals, and photos of him and Melissa at our lake house. "This is private," he began, his voice rising. "Actually," I corrected him, "financial." "Fraud isn't private, it's criminal." I signaled to Sophia, who approached our table with professional composure. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Sophia Rodriguez from First Capital Bank. We need to discuss the accounts you established using forged signatures and fraudulent documentation." Rick's expression shifted from shock to calculation. I had seen this look before. When he was cornered in business negotiations, he was looking for leverage, an escape route. "Ellie, be reasonable." He lowered his voice to an intimate whisper. 35 years together. We can work this out privately. Think about our reputation in the community." "I am thinking about the community," I replied, "particularly the other women being targeted by you and your friends for financial exploitation." His eyes widened at the realization that I knew about the others. "That's not—" "Retirement fund fraud," came Daniel's voice as he approached our table. "Identity theft. Forgery. The list is quite extensive, Mr. Mitchell." Olivia joined us next, introducing herself professionally. "We've been documenting the pattern of financial misconduct, including your communications with James Weller, Paul Harrington, and Jeffrey Trent about targeting retirement assets." Rick's face hardened as he realized the extent of my preparation. "You've been spying on me." "No, Rick. I've been protecting myself from you." I stood up, gathering my purse. "The trust you've been trying to access for the past 2 years? The one my aunt established? It contains provisions that specifically address fraud attempts by spouses. As of today, you have no claim to any assets protected by that trust." "What? Trust?" he asked, genuine confusion breaking through his anger. "Exactly," I said softly. "You never bothered to learn about our complete financial picture? You assumed I was financially dependent on you, when in reality it's been the other way around for years. I left Rick with Sophia and Daniel, who explained the consequences of his actions in clear, unemotional terms. The fraudulent accounts would be frozen. The credit card fraud had been reported. His access to our joint accounts had been restricted to prevent further withdrawals. As I walked out of the restaurant, Olivia beside me, I felt neither triumph nor despair. Instead, I felt purpose taking shape, a clarity about what needed to happen next. "It's not just about Rick," I told Olivia as we stood in the parking lot, the autumn breeze carrying the scent of lake water and turning leaves. "It's about all the others who don't have an Aunt Vivian to teach them how to protect themselves." Olivia squeezed my hand. "Vivian would be so proud of how you're handling this. She would want me to do more," I replied, an idea forming that would transform my personal pain into something constructive. And I intend to. The days after the confrontation at the Lighthouse restaurant unfolded with surprising quietude. Rick moved out that evening without protest, taking only personal belongings and leaving behind a house filled with 35 years of shared memories. I changed the locks anyway. Trust, once broken, cannot be repaired with just promises and apologies. I slept poorly that first night alone, not from sadness, but from the incessant activity of my mind cataloging the signs I had missed over the years. The late-night phone calls he took in his study, the financial discussions he deflected, the subtle isolating from friends who might have noticed discrepancies in our stories. In retrospect, the red flags formed a tapestry of deception so obvious, I wondered how I had missed it. The next morning, I drove to Aunt Vivian's farmhouse on the outskirts of Lakeside. Though she had been gone for 8 years, I had maintained the property exactly as she left it. The sprawling Victorian with its wraparound porch and meticulous gardens. The place where I had learned the most valuable lessons of my life. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped into the foyer, breathing in the familiar scent of lemon oil and old books. The house stood quiet, but not empty. Vivian's presence remained in every carefully chosen piece of furniture, every framed photograph, every shelf of financial journals and economic texts. I ran my fingers along the spines of her collection as I made my way to her study. The antique mahogany desk dominated the room, its surface clear except for a brass lamp and a framed photo of Vivian and me at my college graduation. I settled into her chair, feeling its worn leather conform to me, and opened the center drawer where she had kept her most important documents. The folder was exactly where I remembered, labeled simply, "After." Inside were detailed instructions she had written for me years ago, preparations for scenarios she hoped would never materialize but had anticipated nonetheless. "If you're reading this under difficult circumstances," her neat handwriting began, "remember that endings are also beginnings. What matters is not what was taken from you, but what you build from what remains." Tears blurred my vision momentarily. I wiped them away and continued reading her guidance on navigating financial betrayal, much of which I had already implemented thanks to her earlier teachings. But the final pages contained something unexpected: plans for a financial education center specifically designed for women approaching or in retirement. Vivian had outlined the entire concept: curriculum, budget, staffing needs, and potential community partners. She had even designated a portion of her estate for this purpose, funds I had never accessed because I hadn't realized their intended use. "Financial independence is not just about having money," she had written. "It's about having knowledge, about understanding that money is not merely currency, but protection, freedom, and the ability to shape your own future." Too many women surrender this power, not because they lack intelligence, but because they've been conditioned to trust rather than verify. I set down the papers, struck by the prescience of her words. Even from beyond the grave, Aunt Vivian had provided exactly what I needed. Not just protection from Rick's betrayal, but purpose in its aftermath. My phone chimed with a text from Olivia. "Forensic audit complete. You should see this. Coffee? At my place in an hour? Olivia's lake house had become our unofficial headquarters, its secluded location providing both privacy and a calming backdrop of water and trees. When I arrived, Thomas Reed's car was already parked in the gravel driveway, and the smell of fresh coffee greeted me as I entered. "The scope is worse than we thought," Olivia said without preamble, spreading documents across her dining table. "The identity theft extends beyond the credit cards. Rick created a shell company in your name that's been receiving transfers from not just your accounts, but from those of the other wives as well." Thomas nodded gravely. "It's a laundering operation. The money moves from legitimate retirement accounts through various shells before landing in investment properties and offshore accounts they control." I examined the flowcharts Thomas had created. The scheme's complexity was both impressive and disturbing. 4 men systematically draining their wives' retirement funds through an intricate web of fraudulent companies and manipulated accounts. "What about the other women?" I asked. "Do they know?" Olivia and Thomas exchanged glances. "We don't think so," Olivia said. "Based on the communication we've recovered, the men believe their wives are completely in the dark. They refer to them as..." She hesitated. "As what?" "As the liabilities," Thomas finished, his professional demeanor cracking to reveal genuine disgust. The term hit me like a physical blow. Liabilities. After decades of partnership, of building lives together, these men viewed their wives as financial burdens to be mitigated, rather than partners to be protected. "We need to warn them," I said, firmly. "It's complicated," Olivia cautioned. "We have evidence of criminal activity, but reaching out directly could alert the husbands and potentially lead to evidence being destroyed before authorities can act. Additionally," Thomas added, "we've discovered connections to at least 3 other similar groups in neighboring states. This isn't isolated. It's a network." I thought of the folders Vivian had left me, the plans for education and protection. Then we need to do more than just warn a few individuals. We need to expose the entire operation. Over the next several hours, the 3 of us developed a strategy that balanced immediate intervention with longer-term protection. Thomas would continue gathering digital evidence, documenting the network's communication and financial maneuvers. Olivia would prepare forensic reports for law enforcement, and I would make a seemingly innocuous social overture to the other wives. The Oak Ridge Retirement Community's monthly mixer provided the perfect opportunity. All 3 couples regularly attended, using the social event to maintain their respectable community standing while their financial schemes operated in the background. I had avoided these gatherings since Rick's retirement, finding the superficial conversations tedious. Now, I had purpose in attending. The community center was decorated with autumn-themed centerpieces when I arrived alone the following Friday evening. Conversations paused briefly as I entered. News of Rick's sudden departure had clearly made the rounds, but resumed with the heightened energy that accompanies fresh gossip. I spotted my targets immediately: Helen Weller, Diane Harrington, and Patricia Trent, seated together at a table near the windows. Their husbands stood across the room, heads bent in conversation, occasionally glancing at their phones with the furtive attention of men conducting business they preferred to keep private. I approached the women's table with a warm smile. "Mind if I join you?" Their surprise was evident. In our 30-plus years in the community, I had maintained cordial but distant relationships with most of the residents, focusing instead on my career and the financial literacy programs I occasionally taught at the local college. "Of course, Ellie," Helen said, pulling out a chair. "We were just saying we haven't seen enough of you lately." I settled in, accepting a glass of mediocre Chardonnay from a passing server. "I've been preoccupied. Personal matters." Diane leaned forward, her expression a practiced blend of concern and curiosity. "We heard about Rick. I'm so sorry, dear. These things are always difficult." Her sympathy seemed genuine, which made what I knew about her situation all the more poignant. According to the documents Thomas had recovered, Diane's husband, Paul, had diverted nearly $600,000 from their retirement savings, more than any of the others except Rick. Yes, well, I said carefully. It was quite an education. Discovering. Your husband has been systematically draining your retirement accounts is certainly a wake-up call. All three women stilled, their expressions shifting from polite sympathy to something more alert. Patricia set down her wine glass with deliberate precision. "What exactly do you mean by draining accounts?" she asked. I maintained a calm demeanor, as if discussing nothing more significant than the community's landscaping choices. Oh, the usual methods: forged signatures, unauthorized transfers, identity theft, shell companies designed to hide the money trail. I took a measured sip of, your husbands were quite thorough in their planning. The shock on their faces would have been comical under different circumstances. Helen's hand trembled as she reached for her purse. I think I should go. Before you do, I said softly, sliding 3 business cards across the table. You might want to contact my forensic accountant. She's been tracking the movement of funds from all 4 of our accounts for some time now. Diane's face had lost all color. 4 accounts? What are you talking about? The network, I explained gently. James, Paul, Jeffrey, and Rick. The investment properties in Florida. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The younger women they've been setting up for their retirement phase 2, as they call it in their emails. Patricia's eyes darted to where the men continued their conversation, oblivious to the revelation occurring across the room. That's not possible, she whispered, but her expression revealed dawning recognition of unexplained discrepancies she had likely noticed but dismissed. I thought the same, I assured her, until I saw the evidence. 30 years of marriage, and I never imagined Rick capable of such calculated deception. But the documentation doesn't lie. Helen's shock was transforming into something harder. How did you find out? I overheard a phone call. Then I started paying attention, looking at statements Rick thought I never checked, accounts he thought I couldn't access. I met each woman's gaze directly. The question is, now that you know, what will you do? The energy at the table shifted. These weren't helpless victims, but capable women who had spent decades managing homes, raising children, building communities. They had simply misplaced their trust. A mistake, not a character flaw. What did you do? Diane asked. I smiled. I protected myself. And now I'm helping create a system to protect others. I gestured toward the business cards. Olivia Barnes. She can help you verify everything I've told you and secure whatever assets remain before more disappears. Patricia picked up the card, studying it intently. And if we find what you found, then what? That, I said, rising from the table, is entirely your decision. But I'll be at Vivian's farmhouse tomorrow at 2:00 if you'd like to discuss options. Sometimes the best response to betrayal is collective action, rather than individual suffering. As I walked away, I caught the concerned glances the husbands directed toward their wives' table. They sensed something had changed in the room's dynamics. They were right. All 3 women arrived at Vivian's farmhouse the following afternoon, exactly at 2. They came in separate cars, having told their husbands they were attending a charity planning meeting. Small rebellions, but significant ones for women who had spent decades accounting for their whereabouts to men who, it turned out, had been living double lives of their own. I welcomed them into Vivian's study, where Olivia had set up a secure laptop containing the evidence Thomas had compiled. For the next hour, we methodically walked them through their financial autopsies, the systematic dismantling of retirement, accounts, the forged documents, the parallel lives their husbands had constructed while presenting a facade of comfortable retirement planning. Helen wept quietly when she saw the transfers to a young woman named Caitlin, a former intern at her husband's company, Diane's reaction was cold fury upon discovering that the vacation home in Naples they had supposedly purchased together was actually titled solely to her husband and his girlfriend. Patricia, a former nurse with the most modest retirement savings of the group, showed the least surprise but the most resolve when she learned that nearly 80% of her pension had been diverted. "James has been pushing me to sell the lake cottage my parents left me," Helen said, wiping away tears. "He said we needed the liquidity for medical emergencies as we age. Now I understand why." Diane nodded grimly. "Paul suddenly developed an interest in our estate planning last year. Wanted to simplify everything by putting it all in his name for efficiency. Jeffrey keeps saying my memory isn't what it used to be," Patricia added, suggesting I might be developing early dementia. "I've even started doubting myself, wondering if I really did agree to financial decisions I have no memory of making." "Gaslighting," Olivia explained. "It's a common tactic. Make you question your own competence so you're less likely to challenge their financial maneuvers." I watched understanding dawn across their faces, not just of what had happened, but how systematically it had been orchestrated. "The question now," I said, "is what you want to do about it." The women exchanged glances, a wordless communication passing between them. "What are our options?" Helen asked. Daniel Wong, who had arrived midway through the financial presentation, stepped forward. "Legally, you have several paths. You can pursue criminal charges for the financial fraud and identity theft. You can file for divorce with these documents as evidence of financial misconduct, which would likely result in more favorable settlements. Or you can confront your husbands privately and attempt to negotiate returns of the diverted funds." "What did you do, Ellie?" Patricia asked. "I secured my assets first," I explained. "Thanks to a trust my aunt established years ago, much of what Rick thought he could access was already protected. Then I confronted him with evidence and witnesses present to prevent him from controlling the narrative. The bank has frozen the fraudulent accounts and criminal charges are pending." "But that's not all you're doing," Diane observed shrewdly. "You have this farmhouse set up like a command center. The materials on retirement security, the curriculum outlines on the dining room table. You're planning something bigger." I smiled, appreciating her perceptiveness. "My Aunt Vivian left plans for a financial education center focusing on women approaching retirement. I'm implementing those plans, expanding them to address exactly the kind of targeted financial exploitation we've experienced." I guided them to the dining room, where I had laid out Vivian's original concept documents alongside my expanded vision. The Financial Security Institute would offer education, resources, and direct intervention services for women vulnerable to or experiencing financial exploitation. "This is impressive," Helen said, examining the curriculum outline. "But how do you fund something like this?" "Vivian left resources," I explained, "and I have connections in the financial industry who recognize the need. But more importantly, we have firsthand experience and professional skills." The women looked up, confused. "Helen, you managed donor relations for the University Foundation for 20 years. Diane, you have a background in educational program development. Patricia, your nursing career gave you expertise in recognizing vulnerability and providing appropriate intervention." Understanding dawned in their expressions. "You want us to help build this," Patricia said. "I want us to build this together," I corrected. "Turn our individual betrayals into collective protection for others." Silence fell as they considered the proposition. Outside the farmhouse windows, autumn leaves drifted from ancient maples, their brilliant colors a reminder that endings can be beautiful, necessary precursors to new growth. "I'm in," Patricia said finally. "Jeffrey has taken enough from me. I won't let him take my purpose too. I need to secure what's left first," Helen added pragmatically. "But yes, I want to be part of this." Diane remained quiet, studying the farmhouse with a professional developer's eye. This property would make an ideal campus, she said finally. Classrooms in the main house, maybe residential facilities in the carriage house for women in transition. She looked up, determination replacing the shock that had dominated her expression earlier. Vivian would approve, I think. She would. I agreed, feeling a sense of alignment with my aunt's vision that transcended the pain of recent discoveries. She always said that financial security isn't just about having money. It's about having knowledge, community, and systems of protection. As the afternoon progressed into evening, our discussion evolved from personal grievances to practical planning. Olivia outlined steps for each woman to document and secure their remaining assets. Daniel provided legal options tailored to their specific situations. And together, we began sketching the foundation of what would become the Financial Security Institute. By the time they departed, something fundamental had shifted. They drove away not as victims seeking recovery, but as builders envisioning creation. The transformation was visible in their posture, their voices, their newly purposeful energy. I stood on Vivian's porch, watching their taillights disappear down the long driveway, feeling the weight of recent weeks balanced by the lightness of new possibilities. The betrayal remained real, its pain still sharp at unexpected moments. But it no longer defined the horizon of my future. My phone chimed with a text from Olivia. Thomas found more. Network bigger than we thought. At least 20 couples across 3 states. Call me. I looked back at the farmhouse, its windows glowing warmly against the gathering dusk. 20 more women unaware that their financial security was being systematically dismantled by the men they trusted most. 20 more potential allies in building something stronger than what was being taken from them. I typed a quick reply. Coming to your place now, bringing Vivian's expansion plans. The battle ahead would be challenging, the work of rebuilding substantial. But as I drove through the autumn evening toward Olivia's lake house, I felt something I hadn't expected to find in the aftermath of betrayal: anticipation. Not just for justice or restitution, but for the opportunity to transform individual loss into collective strength. Rick had tried to diminish my future by draining our retirement. Instead, he had inadvertently set me on a path towards something far more valuable than the money he had taken: purpose, community, and the chance to ensure that financial betrayal would become increasingly difficult for men like him to accomplish. For the first time since discovering his deception, I smiled with genuine pleasure. Aunt Vivian would have appreciated the irony. In attempting to steal my financial security, Rick had given me the greatest gift of all, a mission worthy of the next chapter of my life. The autumn chill gave way to winter's first snow as our work at Vivian's farmhouse intensified. What had begun as a response to personal betrayal was evolving into something more structured and far-reaching than I had initially envisioned. The dining room now housed 3 computer workstations where Helen, Diane, and Patricia worked alongside Olivia and Thomas, tracking financial discrepancies and documenting patterns of exploitation. We've identified 32 women in similar situations across the Midwest, Thomas reported during our morning briefing. His cybersecurity expertise had proven invaluable as we unraveled the network's digital footprint. The communication patterns suggest organized recruitment, experienced members bringing in new participants and teaching them the methodology. Patricia, who had emerged as our most meticulous researcher, tapped her pen against a stack of financial records. The targeting isn't random. They focus on women with specific financial profiles, substantial retirement assets, property holdings, and limited day-to-day involvement in financial management. Vulnerability through trust, I observed, thinking of how completely I had delegated certain financial matters to Rick over the years, despite my own financial acumen. They exploit the division of labor that naturally develops in long-term relationships. Helen nodded, her initial devastation now transformed into purposeful anger. James and I were married for 37 years. I trusted him to manage our investments while I handled other aspects of our lives. I never imagined he would use that trust as a weapon. The doorbell interrupted our discussion. Daniel Wong entered, bringing with him a blast of cold air and a woman I didn't recognize, tall, silver-haired, with the poised confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Everyone, this is Margaret Sinclair," Daniel introduced. "Former federal prosecutor specializing in financial crimes, now with the State Attorney General's office. She's interested in our findings." I stepped forward, extending my hand. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Sinclair. We've been hoping to engage law enforcement at a higher level." Margaret's handshake was firm, her assessment of our operation swift and thorough. "Daniel has briefed me on the general situation. I understand you've uncovered what appears to be an organized financial fraud network targeting retirement age women?" "More than that," Olivia interjected, guiding Margaret to our evidence board where photographs, financial flowcharts, and communication timelines created a visual map of the network's activities. "We've documented systematic identity, theft, forgery, wire fraud, and interstate financial crimes spanning at least 3 states. For the next hour, we presented our findings: the methodical movement of retirement funds through shell companies, the pattern of escalating financial isolation, the communication between network members sharing techniques and targets." Margaret listened intently, occasionally asking precise questions that revealed her deep understanding of both the legal and psychological aspects of financial exploitation. When our presentation concluded, she surveyed the room thoughtfully. "You've built a compelling case," she acknowledged. "Ordinarily, these crimes are difficult to prosecute because they occur within marriages, where financial boundaries are often blurred. But the organized nature of this network, the interstate activity, and the clear documentation of forgery and identity theft elevate this significantly." "Will you help us?" Patricia asked directly. Margaret nodded. "My office will open a formal investigation. I'll need copies of everything you've gathered, and formal statements from each of you." She paused, her expression softening slightly. "I should warn you that cases like this can become quite personal in the public eye. Are you prepared for that?" I exchanged glances with the other women, seeing the same resolve I felt reflected in their expressions. "We're past concerning ourselves with appearances," I said. "Our focus now is on stopping this network and protecting other women from experiencing what we did." "Good," Margaret approved. "Because based on what you've shown me, we're likely looking at federal charges across multiple jurisdictions. This won't be quick or quiet." After Margaret departed with digital copies of our evidence, a contemplative silence settled over the farmhouse study. The involvement of the Attorney General's office marked a significant escalation. What had begun as personal protection was now becoming a public reckoning. "This changes our timeline," Diane noted pragmatically. She had taken charge of developing the educational programming for the Institute, her background in curriculum development proving invaluable. "Once charges are filed, there will be media attention. We should accelerate the public launch of the Institute to coincide with the case becoming public knowledge." "Diane's right," Helen agreed. "We need to be ready to channel the attention toward prevention and education, not just punishment." I nodded, appreciating their strategic thinking. The Financial Security Institute had evolved in our planning from a local educational center to a multifaceted organization offering resources, intervention services, and policy advocacy. "We'll need the farmhouse ready for operations within 6 weeks, I decided. "Patricia, can you coordinate with the contractors about finishing the classroom renovations? Helen, let's accelerate the website development and digital resource center." As the others dispersed to their tasks, Olivia remained behind, her expression thoughtful. "There's something we haven't discussed yet," she said quietly when we were alone. "The financial reality of what's happened to these women while we build this response." She was right. While my situation was secure thanks to Vivian's foresight, the others faced significantly diminished retirement resources. Helen had retained her family's lake cottage, but lost nearly 60% of her liquid assets. Patricia's nursing pension had been decimated. Even Diane, the most financially knowledgeable of the group, had discovered nearly $800,000 missing from accounts she thought secure. "They're giving everything to this project," Olivia continued. "Their time, their expertise, their painful personal experiences. But what about their financial future?" I moved to the window, watching snow accumulate on the bare branches of Vivian's maple trees. The solution had been forming in my mind for weeks, but I had hesitated, unsure if it would be welcomed or perceived as charity. "I've been thinking about establishing a restoration fund," I said finally. "Using a portion of the trust assets to create a financial safety net for women who've experienced this type of exploitation. The others would be the first recipients, but it would extend to others we identify through the Institute's work." Olivia considered this. "It's generous, but will they accept it?" "Not as a gift," I acknowledged, "but perhaps as earned compensation for their roles in building the Institute. Helen's development experience alone would command a significant salary in the nonprofit sector. Patricia's case management skills are equally valuable." "A legitimate compensation structure rather than charity," Olivia nodded. "That might work. We could backdate it to when they began working here, provide retirement benefits." Our discussion of the practical details continued into the afternoon, balancing ethical considerations with financial realities. By evening, we had outlined a structure that would provide financial security without compromising dignity, a microcosm of the larger mission we were building. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. Contractors transformed Vivian's farmhouse into a functional educational center, with the stately parlor becoming a classroom, the library a resource center, and the carriage house a temporary residence for women in financial transition. Helen coordinated with local media for our public launch, while Patricia developed intake protocols for women seeking assistance. Thomas continued his digital investigation, identifying more connected cases and documenting the network's methodologies. "They're getting nervous," he reported one snowy morning in late January. "The communication patterns have changed. They know something's happening." "Have they identified us as the source?" I asked, concerned about potential retaliation or evidence destruction. "Not specifically," Thomas said, "but several members have gone dark, including all 4 of your ex-husbands. They've stopped using their regular communication channels." The timing aligned with legal developments. Margaret had called the previous evening to inform us that the Attorney General's office would be filing charges within days: wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy across state lines. Arrests would follow immediately. "We need to accelerate our timeline," I decided. "Let's move the Institute's launch to coincide with the public announcement of the charges." That evening, I gathered everyone in Vivian's study, now our operational headquarters, to discuss the compensation structure Olivia and I had developed. The room felt smaller with all of us present. Helen, Diane, and Patricia, now divorced or in the process. Olivia and Thomas, whose professional involvement had evolved into personal investment, and Daniel, whose legal guidance had expanded beyond his usual practice areas. Before we finalize the Institute's public launch, there's something we need to address, I began. "The financial impact of what's happened to each of you." Diane straightened, pride evident in her posture. "We're not looking for—" I raised a hand gently. "This isn't charity. It's recognition of professional value. Each of you brings expertise that would command significant compensation in any organization. The Institute needs to reflect that reality in its structure." Olivia presented the proposed compensation framework: competitive salaries, retirement benefits, and governance roles that acknowledge their foundational contributions. "This isn't about replacing what was taken," she explained. "It's about properly valuing what you're building." Patricia studied the documents, her practical nurse's assessment evident in her expression. "This is more than fair," she acknowledged. But can the Institute sustain this level of compensation long-term? Vivian's trust provides initial funding, I explained. But we've also secured commitments from 3 financial institutions to support ongoing operations. They recognize that financial education and exploitation prevention serve their legitimate business interests. Helen, who had been quietly reviewing the proposals, looked up with unexpected tears in her eyes. When James took our retirement savings, the hardest part wasn't the money. It was feeling that 37 years of building a life together meant nothing, that my contributions had no value. She tapped the compensation document. This acknowledges that what we bring has real worth. The others nodded in agreement. The validation of their professional value represented something deeper than financial security. It was recognition of their inherent worth after relationships that had ultimately devalued them. Then it's settled, I concluded. We launch the Financial Security Institute next week, with all of you in leadership positions defined by your expertise, not your experience as victims. On a bright February morning, I stood at the windows of Vivian's study, now my office at the Institute, watching reporters gather on the snow-covered lawn. Inside, the farmhouse hummed with purposeful energy as staff prepared for our public's launch. The timing had worked perfectly. The Attorney General's office had announced charges against 18 men across 3 states the previous day, including Rick, James, Jeffrey, and Paul. The media coverage had been extensive, focusing initially on the criminal elements, the systematic targeting of retirement-age women, the elaborate financial schemes, the parallel lives maintained while draining shared resources. But now, attention was turning to the response we had built. A knock at my door preceded Helen's entrance, elegant in a tailored suit that reflected her new role as development director. "They're ready for you," she said. Quite a turnout. All major local networks, 2 national outlets, and several financial industry publications. I nodded, smoothing down my own carefully chosen outfit. The public presentation of our story mattered. Not for vanity's sake, but because how we appeared would affect how our message was received. "The others are already in position," Helen continued. "Diane is handling the educational presentation beautifully. Patricia has already connected with 3 women who called this morning after seeing the news. Together we walked through the transformed farmhouse. Where once family photographs had lined the hallway, educational materials now filled custom shelving. Vivian's formal dining room housed a conference table where financial advisors would provide pro bono consultations. The kitchen had become a welcoming space where women could gather for informal support and resources. Outside, a podium had been set up on the front porch, with the restored Victorian facade of the farmhouse providing a visual backdrop that conveyed both strength and welcome. The symbolism was deliberate. We wanted the Institute to feel both substantial and accessible. As I stepped to the microphone, cameras focused and the murmur of the gathered press quieted. Beyond the reporters, I noticed a small group of women standing at the back of the crowd. Not media, but individuals who had recognized their own situations in the news reports. "Good morning. My name is Eleanor Mitchell, and I am the executive director of the Financial Security Institute." My voice carried clearly in the winter air. "Yesterday, you learned about a criminal network that systematically targeted women for financial exploitation. Today, I want to tell you about the network of protection and education we have built in response." I outlined the Institute's mission: education, intervention, advocacy, and support for women vulnerable to or experiencing financial exploitation. I explained how what had begun as a personal response to betrayal had evolved into a structured organization with professional staff, evidence-based programs, and partnerships with financial institutions and law enforcement. Financial exploitation thrives in isolation, I continued. The men who targeted us counted on shame and embarrassment to keep their victims silent. They believed we would be too humiliated to speak out, too defeated to rebuild, too fragmented to organize. I gestured. To Helen, Diane, and Patricia, who stood confidently to my right. They were wrong. From our individual losses, we have created collective strength. From private betrayals, we have built public protection. A reporter called out the inevitable question, "Ms. Mitchell, how much money did these men steal from their wives?" The criminal complaints detail approximately $12 million diverted from retirement accounts, investment portfolios, and equity holdings, I answered. But the true cost cannot be measured solely in dollars. They stole security, trust, and dignity, intangible assets that cannot be replaced through legal proceedings alone. Another question followed. What would you say to women who fear they might be experiencing similar exploitation? Trust your instincts, I said firmly. Mrs. Mitchell, my client has valuable information about similar operations in other regions. In exchange for his cooperation, we're discussing a reduced sentencing recommendation. I turned to the prosecutor. Is his information actionable? She nodded. Potentially very valuable. Names, methods, financial pathways we haven't identified yet. I considered this, observing Rick's expectant expression. He wanted something from me, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps just acknowledgement. I have no objection to a sentencing consideration based on the value of his cooperation, I said finally. The goal has always been to protect others, not punish. Rick. Relief flickered across his face, quickly replaced by something that looked almost like shame. I never thought about the other women, he admitted quietly. Not really. They were just collateral to the strategy. That's the difference between us now, I responded. To me, they're the reason for everything we're building, not collateral, central. As I gathered my coat to leave, Rick spoke again. Vivian would be proud of you, Ellie. She always said you were stronger than you knew. I paused at the door, struck by the unexpected invocation of my aunt's memory. She also said that the true measure of strength isn't what you can take. Rick, it's what you can build. Stepping back into the winter afternoon, I felt a sense of closure that had nothing to do with Rick's legal fate and everything to do with the path that had opened before me. The betrayal that had initially seemed like an ending had become a beginning, not just for me, but for every woman who would find her way to the Institute's doors. My phone chimed with a message from Patricia. 8 new clients today. 2 have already agreed to share their stories to help others. This was the true restoration, not just of financial security, but of voice, agency, and community. The network of exploitation was being dismantled piece by piece, while our network of protection grew stronger every day. As I drove back to the farmhouse through gently falling snow, I thought about how betrayal had transformed not into bitterness, but into purpose. Rick had tried to diminish my future by draining our retirement fund. Instead, he had inadvertently connected me to a mission larger than any I could have imagined for my later years. Perhaps that was the final lesson Vivian had left for me to discover. Sometimes the greatest gifts arrive disguised as losses, and the deepest betrayals can lead to the most meaningful transformations, not despite the pain they cause, but because of the strength they reveal. Spring arrived at the farmhouse in gentle waves of green, the maple trees outside my office window budding with new life as the Financial Security Institute marked its 3rd month of operation. The transformation of Vivian's property was complete, both physical and purposeful, with every room now serving our mission of education, protection, and restoration. The morning sun streamed through the east-facing windows as I reviewed the latest impact statistics. Since our launch in February, we had served over 200 women directly, provided virtual consultations to another 300 nationwide, and our educational materials had been downloaded more than 20,000 times. Numbers that represented not just activity but actual lives redirected from exploitation toward security. A soft knock preceded Helen's entrance, her arms filled with press clippings and media reports. The Today Show segment aired this morning, she announced, placing a tablet on my desk. Patricia was magnificent, practical, compassionate, and completely relatable. I smiled, recalling how reluctant Patricia had initially been to share her story publicly. The former nurse had worried about appearing vulnerable until she realized that her experience could serve as a bridge for other women hesitant to acknowledge their own financial exploitation. Now she had become our most effective spokesperson, her straightforward manner cutting through shame and isolation to reach women who recognize themselves in her story. Calls are already coming in from the segment, Helen continued. The response team is fully booked through next week. This had become a familiar pattern, each media appearance generating a new wave of women recognizing their situations and reaching out for help. What had begun as a response to our personal betrayals had evolved into a movement, gaining momentum with each story shared and each life redirected. The Michigan State Senate is voting on the Financial Exploitation Prevention Act today, Helen added, referring to legislation we had helped draft. Diane's already at the Capitol with the advocacy team. If it passes, it will require financial institutions to implement enhanced protections for retirement accounts and improve fraud detection systems. I nodded, pride mixing with pragmatism. Even if it passes, implementation will take time, and it's just one state. One state becomes a model for others, Helen reminded me. Change happens in increments, not all at once. After Helen departed, I turned back to the quarterly financial reports. Our initial funding from Vivian's trust had been supplemented by grants from 3 major financial institutions, corporate sponsorships, and a growing endowment funded by individual donors who recognized the importance of our work. The institute was financially secure for the foreseeable future, allowing us to focus on expanding our programs rather than mere survival. My phone chimed with a message from Margaret Sinclair at the Attorney General's office. Plea agreements. Finalized. Federal charges proceeding in parallel. Need to discuss implications for your cases specifically. The legal proceedings against Rick and the others had been moving forward on multiple tracks. State charges for identity theft and fraud, federal charges for wire fraud and conspiracy. The complexity reflected the sophisticated nature of their schemes, which had crossed jurisdictional boundaries and violated multiple statutes. I texted back, "Available this afternoon. Institute or your office?" Margaret's response came quickly. "Your office. This should happen on your territory." Her choice of location suggested that the news was significant, perhaps not disastrous, but substantial enough to warrant the personal touch. I sent a quick message to Olivia and Daniel, asking them to join the meeting, then returned to my review of our operations. The morning passed quickly in a series of programmatic discussions and funding decisions. Lunch was a working affair in what had once been Vivian's sunroom, now transformed into a staff lounge where the Institute's growing team gathered around a large farm table. The atmosphere reminded me of academic environments I had enjoyed during my financial analyst career. Purposeful, collaborative, and intellectually engaged. Margaret arrived precisely at 2, her professional demeanor softened slightly by familiarity, after months of working together. Daniel and Olivia joined us in my office, settling into the comfortable seating area near the windows, where spring light illuminated the garden's new growth. "The plea agreements have been accepted by the court," Margaret began, opening her briefcase. 17 of the 18 defendants have agreed to terms, including asset forfeiture, restitution, and prison sentences ranging from 36 to 60 months. "And the 18th?" Olivia asked. "Going to trial. Joseph Berger from the Cincinnati group claims he was a peripheral participant, though our evidence suggests otherwise." Margaret distributed documents outlining the agreements. "The most relevant aspect for your cases is the restitution structure." I scanned the paperwork, noting the detailed financial arrangements. "They're surrendering all identified assets," Margaret nodded. "Properties, investment accounts, vehicles, everything we could trace to the diverted funds. The total recovery value is approximately 60% of what was taken." 60%. a substantial recovery by legal standards, but still a permanent loss of 40% of the retirement resources these women had spent decades building. For some, even this partial recovery would make the difference between financial stability and insecurity in their later years. "What about the funds we couldn't trace?" Daniel asked, ever the practical attorney. Margaret's expression tightened slightly. "Spent. Luxury goods, travel, gifts for girlfriends, cash withdrawals. The recovery percentage reflects the maximum we could locate and freeze before it disappeared completely." I thought of Patricia, whose nursing pension had been decimated, and Helen, whose financial future had been altered irrevocably despite the recovery efforts. The restitution would help, but it couldn't fully restore what had been taken, both tangible assets and intangible security. "There's something else," Margaret continued, her tone shifting. "As part of their cooperation, several of the defendants have provided detailed information about how they identified and targeted their victims. The methodology was more systematic than we initially understood." She handed me another document, this one outlining what could only be described as a predatory playbook, detailed strategies for identifying vulnerable women, gaining their trust, isolating them from financial oversight, and gradually assuming control of their assets. "They shared techniques," Olivia observed, reading over my shoulder. "Refined their approaches based on what worked." Margaret nodded grimly. Rick was particularly forthcoming about the methodology. He described how they would attend retirement seminars specifically to identify women who showed signs of financial naivety despite substantial assets. I tried to recall such seminars in our past, realizing with a chill that Rick had often suggested we attend financial planning events when we approached retirement age. Had he been perfecting his techniques even then, studying potential targets, while sitting beside his intended first victim? "We'd like your help developing countermeasures," Margaret said. "Educational materials specifically designed to alert women to these tactics. The Institute's expertise would be invaluable." "Of course," I agreed, already envisioning how this inside information could strengthen our prevention programs. "We'll create targeted resources based on these specific methods." After Margaret departed, Olivia remained behind, studying the predatory playbook with professional detachment mixed with personal disgust. "It's almost impressive in its calculated efficiency," she noted. "They left nothing to chance." "Except us," I pointed out. "They never anticipated that their victims would unite and create a systematic response." Olivia smiled, the expression containing equal parts satisfaction and determination. "Their biggest mistake was assuming isolation would ensure silence. They never understood that shared experience creates the strongest bonds." That evening, I hosted a dinner for the Institute's founding team, Helen, Diane, Patricia, Olivia, Thomas, and Daniel, to share the news about the plea agreements and discuss the implications for our work. Vivian's formal dining room, now our conference space, retained enough of its original elegance to make the occasion feel both professional and personal. 60% recovery is actually remarkable, Daniel noted as we discussed the financial implications. In most financial fraud cases, victims recover less than 30%. Tell that to someone who spent 30 years building a retirement fund, only to lose nearly half of it in their 60s, Patricia replied, her practical, nurse's perspective grounding our discussion in reality. The mathematics of starting over at our age are unforgiving. Helen, who had been quietly studying the documents, looked up with unexpected intensity. This information about how they selected and isolated their targets, it changes our approach, doesn't it? We've been focusing on financial education, but this suggests we need equal emphasis on recognizing emotional manipulation. Diane nodded thoughtfully. The financial exploitation was the end result, but the methodology began with relationship manipulation, isolating women from financial information, creating dependence, undermining confidence. I thought about my own experience with Rick, how, gradually, he had assumed control of certain financial matters, how subtly he had discouraged my involvement in our retirement planning, despite my professional background. The erosion had been so incremental, I hadn't recognized it until confronted with its consequences. We need to rebuild our curriculum, I decided. Integrate this new information throughout our programs, not just add it as a separate component. The conversation shifted to implementation strategies, with Diane outlining revisions to our educational materials and Patricia suggesting adjustments to our intake protocols to better identify women in the early stages of financial isolation. Thomas proposed enhanced digital security measures based on the network's documented methods of accessing private financial information. As the evening progressed, I observed the transformation that had occurred in these women over the past months. Helen, initially devastated by her husband's betrayal, now spoke with the confident authority of a development director building programs with national reach. Diane, who had questioned her own judgment after decades with a manipulative spouse, now designed curricula that would protect thousands of women from similar deception. Patricia, who had lost the majority of her nursing pension, now helped others navigate the complex emotions of financial betrayal with compassionate expertise. They had not merely survived betrayal. They had translated their experiences into protection for others, their personal pain into communal strength. In doing so, they had reclaimed not just financial security, but purpose and agency in their later years. The following morning, I woke before sunrise and found myself drawn to Aunt Vivian's desk, my desk now, where generations of women had managed resources, made decisions, and shaped legacies. Opening the center drawer, I removed the journal I had been maintaining since the Institute's inception, recording not just operational details, but reflections on the deeper meaning of our work. 3 months since launch, I wrote as dawnlight gradually illuminated the garden. Over 500 women directly served, lives redirected, resources recovered, security restored. But perhaps most significantly, isolation transformed into community. What began as individual betrayal has become collective protection. I paused, considering how to capture the essence of what we had created from the ashes of our broken marriages. The men who targeted us saw only what they could take. They never imagined what we would build in response. A soft knock interrupted my writing. Patricia stood in the doorway, already dressed for the day despite the early hour. "Couldn't sleep," she explained with a wry smile. "Too many thoughts after yesterday's news." I gestured toward the sitting area by the windows, where the first light of day was painting the garden in gentle pastels. "Tea?" "Please." She settled into one of the armchairs, her practical demeanor momentarily softened by morning light. "I've been thinking about what happens next." "With the Institute?" I asked, preparing 2 cups from the electric kettle I kept on a side table. "With us," she clarified. "Helen, Diane, me, you. When we started this, we were responding to immediate crisis. Now we're building something lasting." She accepted the tea with a nod of thanks. I never imagined having this kind of purpose in my 70s. I understood exactly what she meant. At 60, I had anticipated a conventional retirement, travel, with Rick, perhaps some volunteer work, gradual disengagement from professional identity. Instead, I found myself leading an organization with growing national influence, engaged in work more meaningful than anything in my previous career. I wondered if I would resent it, Patricia continued, gazing out at the garden where flowers were beginning to emerge. Having to reinvent my life at this stage? Start over when I should have been settled. She turned back to me, her expression reflective. But I don't. I feel more authentic in this work than I ever did before. Because it matters, I suggested. Because it connects, she corrected gently. What they tried to destroy wasn't just our finances. It was our sense of belonging, of being valued. This work restores that, not just for us, but for every woman who finds her way here. The wisdom of her observations stayed with me throughout the day as we hosted a financial security workshop for 30 women from local retirement communities. Watching Diane lead a session on recognizing manipulative financial tactics, I saw the participants gradually shift from hesitant listeners to engaged participants, their isolation dissolving as they recognized their experiences in others' stories. During the lunch break, a participant approached me, well-dressed, probably mid-60s, with an air of carefully maintained composure that reminded me of myself months earlier. "Ms. Mitchell," she began, "I'm Caroline Winters. Your work is illuminating." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "My husband handles all our investments, has for 40 years. I've never questioned it because he's in finance and I'm not. But some of what Ms. Harrington described this morning sounds familiar." I recognized the delicate moment, the first acknowledgement of possible vulnerability, the tentative reaching for information that might confirm or dispel growing suspicions. "Financial specialization in marriages is common," I said gently, "and usually benign, but verification is always appropriate, regardless of trust. Would you like to speak with one of our advisors about non-confrontational ways to assess your financial situation?" Relief softened her features. "Yes, I would. Not because I necessarily think anything is wrong, but because knowledge brings peace of mind either way," I finished for her. "We have advisors available this afternoon, or we can schedule a private consultation later this week." By day's end, Caroline had met with our financial counselor, scheduled a follow-up appointment, and left with resources for conducting a preliminary assessment of her financial situation. Whether she discovered actual exploitation or simply gained greater involvement in her financial future, she had taken steps toward security that would serve her regardless of what she found. These moments, helping women cross the threshold from uncertainty to action, had become the most rewarding aspect of my work at the Institute. The transformation from isolation to agency happened not in dramatic confrontations, but in quiet decisions to seek knowledge, verify assumptions, and connect with others who understood the emotional complexity of financial vulnerability. As evening approached, I received an unexpected call from Margaret. "The Michigan Senate passed the Financial Exploitation Prevention Act," she announced without preamble. 78% support. The governor will sign it next week." "That's remarkable," I replied, genuinely surprised by the margin. Financial legislation rarely garnered such definitive support, particularly measures that imposed new requirements on institutions. "Your testimony made the difference," Margaret continued. "Specifically, the data you presented on recovery costs versus prevention investments. The fiscal conservatives couldn't argue with the mathematics." I smiled, recalling the careful financial analysis we had prepared demonstrating that preventative measures cost a fraction of post-exploitation recovery efforts. Vivian had always maintained that economic arguments often succeeded where emotional appeals failed, a lesson I had applied in our advocacy work. "The governor wants you at the signing ceremony," Margaret added. "This legislation establishes Michigan as a model for other states. Several legislators from neighboring states have already requested your prevention framework." After ending the call, I stepped outside onto the farmhouse porch, breathing in the sweet scent of spring blossoms from Vivian's carefully planned gardens. The property that had once been a family home had become headquarters for work with nationwide implications, a transformation that mirrored my own journey from betrayed spouse to organizational leader. Rick had seen this place as nothing more than a potential asset to liquidate for his personal benefit. He had never understood its true value lay not in its market price, but in its potential as a center for protection, education, and community. His limited vision had been focused on what could be taken. Mine had expanded to what could be built. The following week brought the ceremonial signing of the Financial Exploitation Prevention Act at the state capitol. Standing beside the governor as she applied her signature to legislation we had helped craft, I thought about how dramatically my life had changed in the months since discovering Rick's betrayal. What had initially felt like an ending of my marriage, of financial security, of a planned retirement, had instead become the beginning of something far more significant than I could have imagined. The Institute now employed 15 full-time staff, partnered with financial institutions nationwide, and provided resources that reached thousands of women each month. This legislation establishes Michigan as a leader in protecting seniors from financial exploitation, the governor stated during her remarks. By requiring enhanced verification protocols, fraud detection systems, and specialized training for financial professionals, we are creating layers of protection for our most vulnerable citizens. I was asked to speak next, approaching the podium with the confidence that comes from absolute conviction in one's purpose. The audience included legislators, financial industry representatives, and advocates from senior organizations, stakeholders, whose cooperation would be essential for successful implementation. Financial exploitation thrives in isolation, I began, echoing the core message that had become the Institute's guiding principle. The men who targeted women like me and my colleagues counted on shame and secrecy to protect their activities. This legislation disrupts that isolation by creating systemic protections that operate regardless of individual awareness or advocacy. I outlined the key provisions: enhanced authentication requirements for retirement account withdrawals, mandatory cooling periods for large transactions from senior accounts, specialized training for bank employees to recognize signs of exploitation, and improved coordination between financial institutions and adult protective services. These measures would have prevented or substantially limited the exploitation that women like Helen Weller, Diane Harrington, Patricia Trent, and I experienced, I explained. Our losses were not inevitable. They were enabled by systems designed without adequate safeguards against predatory behavior. As I concluded my remarks, I noticed a woman in the audience watching with particular intensity, perhaps in her 70s, elegantly dressed, with an expression of recognition that I had come to identify in those who saw their own experiences reflected in our work. After the ceremony, she approached, introducing herself as Victoria Palmer, a retired judge. "Your institute's work is extraordinary," she said, her handshake firm and direct. "I've been following your development since your launch in February." I thanked her for her support, sensing there was more she wanted to discuss. "I presided over family court for 30 years, she continued. "Saw countless cases of financial exploitation within marriages, but rarely had adequate remedies available. The patterns were clear, but the legal framework was insufficient." She handed me her card. "I'd like to discuss the possibility of developing judicial education programs through your institute. Many judges lack specific training in recognizing and addressing financial exploitation patterns." By the time I returned to the farmhouse that evening, Victoria's proposal had evolved into concrete plans for a judicial education initiative, expanding our work into yet another dimension of protection and intervention. What had begun as a response to personal betrayal continued to grow in directions I could never have anticipated, each expansion reaching new populations of women vulnerable to exploitation. The farmhouse was quiet as I made my way to Vivian's study, my office, and settled behind the desk where generations of Mitchell women had managed resources and built legacies. Opening my journal, I recorded the day's achievements and outlined emerging possibilities, continuing the documentation of our work that would guide future leaders of the Institute. On the wall opposite the desk hung a commissioned painting unveiled at our 3-month anniversary celebration, a symbolic representation of our mission showing women of various ages linked in a protective circle. The artist had incorporated subtle elements representing financial security and education throughout the composition, creating a visual embodiment of our work. As twilight deepened outside the windows, I reflected on the transformation that had occurred not just in the farmhouse, but in myself. The woman who had stood shocked in her kitchen hearing her husband plan the liquidation of their retirement accounts had evolved into someone new, not defined by betrayal, but by the response to it. Rick had intended to diminish my future, to reduce me to financial dependency while he built a new life with resources we had accumulated together. Instead, his actions had inadvertently connected me to purpose, community, and impact beyond anything I had envisioned for my later years. The betrayal remained a fact of my history, neither forgotten nor defining, but transformed from an ending into a beginning. The pain had not disappeared, but had been channeled into creation rather than destruction, protection rather than vulnerability, community rather than isolation. This, perhaps, was Vivian's final and most important lesson: that true security comes not from avoiding betrayal, but from how we choose to respond when it finds us. Not in what we prevent from being taken, but in what we commit ourselves to building in its place. Summer settled over Lakeside with languid warmth, the gardens surrounding the farmhouse bursting with life as the Financial Security Institute marked its 6th month of operation. The maple trees that had been bare when we began our work now created a canopy of shade over the new outdoor classroom space where weekly community workshops attracted growing attendance. On this particular morning, I stood at my office window watching a group of women gather on the lawn, participants in our latest program designed specifically for widows navigating financial transitions. Victoria Palmer, the retired judge who had joined our team as Judicial Education Director, was leading the session, her authoritative presence balanced by genuine empathy born from her own experience as a widow who had faced financial confusion following her husband's death. A soft knock at my door preceded Olivia's entrance, tablet in hand and expression thoughtful. "The quarterly impact assessment is ready," she said, settling into one of the chairs opposite my desk. "We've reached a significant milestone." I joined her, accepting the tablet and scanning the detailed analysis. The numbers told a story of expanding reach and deepening impact. Over 1,000 women served directly through our programs. Another 5,000 reached through virtual consultations, and our educational materials now implemented in retirement planning programs across 9 states. "The recovery statistics are particularly striking," Olivia noted, directing my attention to a graph showing financial outcomes. "For women who engaged with our services within 3 months of suspecting exploitation, the average recovery rate is 82%. This represented a dramatic improvement over the 60% recovery achieved in our founding cases. Early intervention, it seemed, made a substantial difference in preserving financial resources, a finding with significant implications for our prevention strategies. We should emphasize this in the awareness campaign," I suggested, making notes as I considered the messaging. Concrete numbers showing the benefit of early action might overcome the reluctance many women feel about investigating their suspicions. Olivia nodded in agreement. "There's something else you should see." She navigated to another section of the report, detailing the backgrounds of women seeking our services. "We're seeing a significant broadening of our demographic reach. Initially, most of our clients resembled our founding group: educated, middle to upper middle class women from long-term marriages. Now we're reaching across socioeconomic and educational spectrums. This diversification reflected intentional outreach efforts we had implemented after realizing our initial approach inadvertently created barriers for certain communities. By partnering with faith organizations, cultural centers, and community service providers, we had extended our reach to women who might never find their way to a formal financial institution for assistance. The Community Ambassador Program is proving particularly effective," Olivia continued, highlighting statistics showing higher engagement rates in areas where we had trained local leaders to recognize and respond to signs of financial exploitation. "Women are more likely to seek help when the entry point is someone they already trust." Our conversation was interrupted by Helen's arrival, her expression conveying urgency despite her typical composure. "Senator Wallace's office just called." The federal financial protection bill is facing unexpected opposition. They've requested your testimony before the committee next week. The legislation in question represented an expansion of Michigan's successful model to the federal level, implementing protections for retirement accounts nationwide. Its progress had seemed assured until recently, when certain financial sector interests had begun raising concerns about implementation costs and administrative burden. "Send me the latest opposition points," I requested, already mentally rearranging my schedule. "And contact Margaret to coordinate our response with the Attorney General's office." Helen nodded, making notes. "The hearing is scheduled for Wednesday in Washington. They've offered Tuesday afternoon for preparation with the legislative team." After Helen departed, Olivia remained, her expression thoughtful. "This opposition isn't unexpected. The network we exposed was relatively small compared to the systemic vulnerabilities the federal legislation would address. There are significant financial interests invested in maintaining fewer safeguards." She was right. Our work had begun by exposing a specific network of exploitation, but had evolved to address the systemic conditions that enabled such predation to flourish. The deeper we delved into financial structures, the more clearly we identified institutional practices that, whether by design or negligence, facilitated exploitation of vulnerable individuals, particularly aging women. "It's not just about husbands stealing from wives anymore," I observed. "It's about changing systems that have historically prioritized efficiency and profit over protection and security." The broader implications of our work had become increasingly clear as the Institute expanded. What had begun as a response to personal betrayal had evolved into a movement challenging fundamental assumptions about financial systems, particularly as they affected women in later life stages. The following Tuesday found me in Washington, seated in a congressional office building reviewing testimony with Senator Wallace's legislative director and staff from the Senate Special Committee on Aging. The opposition talking points had been refined since our initial briefing, less focused on direct criticism of the protections themselves and more on concerns about implementation timelines and compliance costs. "They're attempting to delay without appearing to oppose," noted Catherine Reed, the committee's chief counsel. "Classic strategy when direct opposition would seem callous or indifferent to vulnerable populations." I nodded, recognizing the approach from my financial analyst days. "We need to reframe the economic argument then. Not just the cost of implementation, but the cost of failing to implement." For the next several hours, we refined my testimony, incorporating data from the Institute's impact assessment that quantified the economic burden of financial exploitation, not just on individual victims, but on public resources often called upon when seniors lost retirement security. By presenting these costs alongside the much lower expense of preventative measures, we created a fiscal argument that complemented the moral imperative. That evening, I returned to my hotel room and opened my laptop to find an unexpected email waiting, a message from Rick, the first direct communication since his sentencing 4 months earlier. My finger hovered over the delete button before curiosity overcame reluctance. "Ellie," the message began simply, "I saw you'll be testifying tomorrow on the financial protection bill. The changes you're creating, they matter. What we did was worse than I allowed myself to understand at the time. The women whose lives we damaged deserved better. I know words can't repair that damage, but I wanted you to know that some of us have come to recognize the real impact of our actions. Rick." I sat back, surprised not by the apology itself, but by its timing and context. Rick had been cooperative during the legal proceedings, but his motivations had seemed primarily self-interested, reducing his sentence through valuable information. This message, sent privately with no apparent strategic benefit, suggested something else. Perhaps the beginning of genuine recognition of the harm he had caused. I did not reply. Some communications require no response. They exist as statements complete in themselves. But I did not delete the message either, filing it instead in a folder I had created for documentation related to our founding cases. Whatever Rick's intentions, his acknowledgement represented a marker in the evolution of our work, an indicator that awareness was penetrating even those who had once been perpetrators. The next morning, I dressed with particular care for my testimony, selecting a navy suit that conveyed both authority and accessibility. The pearls that had been Vivian's completed the ensemble, a tangible connection to the woman whose foresight had not only protected me from financial devastation, but had established the foundation for the Institute's work. The hearing room was larger than I had anticipated, with television cameras positioned discreetly and a gallery already filled with observers when I arrived. I recognized faces from senior advocacy organizations, financial institutions, and media outlets specializing in retirement issues. Our work had drawn attention from constituencies beyond those we directly served, a testament to the broader implications of financial exploitation. Senator Wallace greeted me warmly before the proceedings began. "We're facing determined opposition," she warned quietly. "Industry representatives have been meeting with committee members all week. Some who were supportive are now wavering." I nodded, understanding the dynamics at play. "Then we'll need to make the case not just to the committee but to their constituents, who are watching." When called to testify, I approached the witness table with the confidence that comes from absolute conviction. The microphone amplified my voice throughout the chamber as I delivered opening remarks that framed financial exploitation not as an individual misfortune, but as a systemic failure requiring structural response. This legislation addresses vulnerabilities that affect millions of Americans as they transition into retirement, I explained. The exploitation my colleagues and I experienced was not exceptional. It was simply exceptionally well documented. Our cases provided a window into methods that are used daily against those who have spent decades building financial security. I outlined the key provisions of the proposed legislation: enhanced verification requirements for significant withdrawals from retirement accounts, cooling periods for large transactions, specialized training for financial professionals, and improved coordination between institutions and protective services. These measures would have prevented or substantially limited the exploitation that the Institute's founding members experienced, I noted. Our financial losses were not inevitable. They were enabled by systems designed without adequate safeguards against predatory behavior. The questioning began with Senator Wallace, whose supportive inquiries allowed me to emphasize key points about prevention costs versus recovery expenses. The Institute's data indicates that for every dollar invested in prevention measures, approximately $8 in exploitation losses are averted, I explained, directing committee members to the economic analysis in their briefing materials. Senator Blackburn from Tennessee, known for his skepticism of regulatory measures, posed the next question. "Ms. Mitchell, the financial industry representatives who testified yesterday expressed concern about the compliance burden these requirements would place on smaller institutions. How do you respond to their concerns about implementation costs?" I had anticipated this line of questioning. "Senator, the legislation includes tiered implementation timelines based on institution size, precisely to address those concerns. But more fundamentally, we must recognize that these costs are already being borne by our economy, not as visible compliance expenses, but as hidden costs of exploitation that appear later in increased social service needs when seniors lose their retirement security." The questioning continued for nearly an hour, ranging from technical details of implementation to broader concerns about financial autonomy and personal responsibility. Throughout, I maintained focus on our central message: financial exploitation thrives in isolation, and systemic protections create safeguards that function regardless of individual awareness or advocacy. As the hearing concluded, Senator Wallace approached with cautious optimism. "You've moved some of the undecideds," she noted quietly. The personal stories combined with hard data made an impression. We'll know more in the coming days as the committee considers amendments. I gathered my materials, satisfied that we had presented the strongest possible case for the legislation. Whether it would be sufficient to overcome industry resistance remained to be seen, but we had established financial exploitation as a matter of public concern rather than private misfortune, a significant shift in the conversation. Returning to the hotel, I found messages waiting from the Institute team who had watched the proceedings via live stream. Helen reported increased website traffic and consultation requests, suggesting the hearing had prompted women to seek information about their own financial situations. Diane noted specific points from my testimony that could be incorporated into our educational materials. Patricia simply wrote, "You spoke for all of us. Thank you." The following morning, before departing for the airport, I received a call from Senator Wallace's office. "The committee has scheduled a markup session for next week," her legislative director informed me. "They're moving faster than expected, which suggests momentum in our favor. Your testimony made a difference." By the time I returned to Lakeside that evening, news outlets were reporting increased likelihood of the legislation advancing to a floor vote, a critical step toward implementing nationwide protections similar to those we had helped establish in Michigan. The farmhouse welcomed me back with the comfortable familiarity of a space that had transformed from Vivian's private residence to our shared mission headquarters without losing its essential character. Light spilled from windows that had once illuminated family gatherings and now brightened planning sessions and client consultations. The gardens that had been Vivian's personal pleasure now provided therapeutic spaces for women rebuilding their sense of security and possibility. I found Helen, Diane, and Patricia still working in the conference room despite the late hour, surrounded by materials for an upcoming training program for financial advisors. Their dedication no longer surprised me. Like me, they had discovered purpose that transcended conventional retirement expectations, transforming personal betrayal into meaningful contribution. "The senator's office called," Helen reported as I joined them. "They're requesting our input on potential amendments to strengthen the verification requirements for joint accounts." Diane looked up from curriculum materials she was reviewing. "Your point about exploitation occurring within relationships of trust particularly resonated. They want to ensure the legislation addresses that specific vulnerability." I settled into a chair, accepting the cup of tea Patricia offered. It's progress. Not victory yet, but meaningful progress. "More than we imagined 6 months ago," Patricia noted, her practical nature balanced by growing optimism. "From responding to our own situations to potentially changing federal policy, it's quite a journey." The conversation shifted to upcoming Institute initiatives, a training program for healthcare providers to recognize signs of financial exploitation, an expanded online resource center, and community education partnerships with senior centers nationwide. What had begun as a local response to personal betrayal had evolved into a multifaceted organization with national reach and growing influence. Later that evening, after the others had departed, I remained in Vivian's study, my office, reflecting on the trajectory that had brought us to this point. The betrayal that had initially seemed devastating had become merely the opening chapter in a story of unexpected purpose and impact. My phone chimed with a message from Caroline Winters, the woman who had approached me tentatively at a workshop months earlier. Financial review completed. Discovered unauthorized accounts and diverted funds, using Institute resources to secure remaining assets. Thank you for helping me find courage to look more closely. This message, one of many similar communications we received weekly, represented the essence of our work, not just helping women after exploitation occurred, but empowering them to recognize warning signs and take protective action before devastation was complete. I added Caroline's message to our impact documentation, maintaining the meticulous records that both measured our effectiveness and guided our evolving strategies. The data told a story of expanding reach and deepening impact. Individual lives redirected, community awareness increased, and institutional practices challenged. The following week brought news that the Senate committee had approved the Financial Protection Bill with strengthened provisions regarding joint accounts and enhanced training requirements for financial professionals. The legislation would advance to floor consideration with bipartisan support, not unanimous, but sufficient to suggest positive prospects for passage. This legislative progress coincided with another significant development at the Institute. The board approved expansion of our facility to include the adjacent property, a former bed and breakfast that would provide residential accommodations for women participating in our intensive recovery programs. This addition would enable us to serve individuals from beyond the immediate region, particularly those who needed temporary relocation for safety or practical reasons. The expansion represented not just physical growth, but evolution of our mission. What had begun as education and advocacy was developing into comprehensive support for women rebuilding their lives after financial exploitation, addressing not just the practical aspects of recovery, but the emotional and social dimensions as well. As summer progressed toward autumn, I found myself increasingly reflecting on the transformative journey of the past 8 months. The shock of discovering Rick's betrayal had evolved into purpose that extended far beyond my personal recovery. The anger that might have consumed me had instead fueled creation of systems that would protect countless women I would never meet. On a particularly beautiful August evening, I left the farmhouse after a full day of meetings and found myself driving toward Cedar Lake rather than home. The lakefront path where Rick and I had often walked during our marriage now offered solitude for reflection, as sunset painted the water in shades of gold and crimson. I sat on a bench overlooking the lake, watching light play across gentle waves and contemplating the unexpected turns life can take. 8 months earlier, I had imagined a conventional retirement with a husband of 35 years. Now I led an organization with national impact, surrounded by colleagues who had become family through shared purpose rather than conventional ties. My phone chimed with an email notification, a message from Margaret Sinclair at the Attorney General's office with the subject line, "Case Closure Notification." The final legal proceedings related to our founding cases had concluded with Joseph Berger's guilty verdict in federal court. All 18 members of the network we had exposed now faced consequences for their actions, with restitution payments beginning to reach the affected women. This legal conclusion represented a chapter ending, a form of justice achieved. But the work it had inspired continued to expand, addressing not just individual perpetrators, but the conditions that enabled their exploitation to succeed. The Institute had evolved from response to prevention, from personal healing to systemic change. As twilight deepened over Cedar Lake, I found myself filled with an emotion that transcended the betrayal that had initiated this journey. Not happiness, exactly, but something deeper and more sustaining. Purpose, perhaps, or the particular satisfaction that comes from creating meaning from what was intended to diminish. Rick had aimed to reduce me to financial dependency in my later years, to dismantle the security we had supposedly built together. Instead, his actions had connected me to work more meaningful than any I had previously known, and to relationships forged in shared resilience rather than convenience or convention. Walking back along the lakeshore as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I considered how completely my understanding of security had transformed. No longer defined primarily by financial assets, security now encompassed purpose, community, and the knowledge that what had been built from betrayal would continue to protect and empower others long after my personal experience had faded into history. The following morning brought the Institute's weekly leadership meeting, where program directors shared updates and coordinated priorities. Victoria Palmer reported growing interest in our judicial education initiative from courts across the region. Thomas outlined enhanced cybersecurity measures for our expanding online consultation services. Diane presented revised curriculum incorporating insights from our latest impact assessment. As I listened to these reports, I was struck by how thoroughly The institute had transcended its origins. What had begun as a response to personal betrayal had evolved into a multifaceted organization addressing vulnerabilities that affected millions. The emotional impetus remained, the determination that others should be protected from what we had experienced, but it now operated through systems and structures that would endure beyond any individual's involvement. The Federal Financial Protection Bill is scheduled for floor debate next month, Helen reported, concluding our update session. Senator Wallace's office has requested our presence for the vote. This legislative milestone represented both culmination and beginning, the potential implementation of protections we had helped design, and the opening of new possibilities for systemic change. Whatever the outcome of the vote, the conversation about financial security in later life had been fundamentally altered by our work, bringing previously hidden vulnerabilities into public awareness. After the meeting, I returned to my office and opened the journal I had maintained since the Institute's inception. The early entries captured raw determination born from betrayal, the urgent need to protect myself and help others do the same. Later pages documented evolving programs, expanding partnerships, and growing impact as our work gained momentum and reach. Today's entry would mark both endings and beginnings, the formal conclusion of legal proceedings that had prompted our founding and the advancement of legislation that might prevent countless future exploitations. The cycle of response, recovery, and prevention continued, with each phase informing and strengthening the others. As I composed my thoughts, Patricia appeared in the doorway with afternoon tea, a ritual she had instituted months earlier as our work intensified. The new client intake assessments are showing interesting patterns, she noted as she arranged cups on the small table by the window. Women who come to us through community referrals report exploitation at earlier stages than those who self-identify, through our general materials. This observation aligned with our growing understanding of how isolation facilitated exploitation. Women connected to community resources recognized and responded to warning signs more quickly than those navigating concerns in solitude, a finding with significant implications for our outreach strategies. We should expand the Community Ambassador Program, I suggested, accepting the tea Patricia offered. Train more local leaders to recognize early indicators and facilitate connections to our services. Patricia nodded in agreement. I've already discussed preliminary plans with Diane. We believe we could triple our community anchors within 6 months with targeted recruitment and streamlined training. As we discussed implementation details, I was struck by how naturally our collaborative process had evolved. What had begun as crisis response among betrayed women had developed into professional partnership, grounded in shared purpose and complementary skills. Patricia's nursing background, Diane's educational expertise, Helen's development experience, and my financial knowledge combined to create approaches none of us could have devised individually. Later that afternoon, I drove to First Capital Bank for a meeting with Sofia Rodriguez, now the Regional Director for Retirement Security. Our relationship with financial institutions had evolved from confrontation to collaboration as banks recognized both the moral and business imperatives of protecting clients from exploitation. The pilot program has exceeded expectations, Sophia reported as we reviewed implementation of enhanced verification protocols for retirement account transactions. Potential exploitation attempts decreased by 63% in branches. Using the new system and customer satisfaction actually increased despite the additional verification steps. This data confirmed our central argument that well-designed protections enhanced rather than impeded financial relationships, creating security that benefited both institutions and their clients. The business case for prevention was proving as compelling as the moral imperative, particularly as banks calculated the costs of fraud recovery and damaged client relationships. We're prepared to implement system-wide next quarter, Sophia continued, and share the results with the National Association as a case study in effective prevention. The transformation in how financial institutions approached exploitation prevention represented perhaps the most significant systemic change we had influenced. From reluctant compliance with minimum legal requirements, many banks were moving toward proactive protection as a service enhancement and risk management strategy. As summer eased toward autumn, the Institute hosted a milestone celebration marking its 6-month anniversary. The farmhouse grounds accommodated nearly 200 guests, clients who had rebuilt their financial security with our assistance, professionals implementing our protocols in their practices, donors supporting our expansion, and community partners extending our reach to vulnerable populations. Standing on Vivian's porch, now the Institute's entrance, I surveyed the gathering, with a sense of wonder at what had grown from personal betrayal. Women who had arrived months earlier in various states of financial and emotional crisis now moved confidently through the crowd, many serving as volunteer mentors for newer clients still navigating their recovery journeys. Helen appeared at my side, offering a glass of champagne from trays circulating among the guests. "Quite a different gathering than our first planning session," she observed with a smile. "Remember how we spread financial documents across your dining table and wondered if anyone else would care about what had happened to us?" I nodded, recalling those early days when our focus had been primarily on securing our own remaining assets and documenting the pattern of exploitation. We had no idea where it would lead, or how many others were experiencing the same thing in isolation, Helen added. "That's still the most important thing we do, breaking the isolation that enables exploitation to continue." As twilight settled over the gathering, I was approached by a woman I hadn't met before. Tall, elegantly dressed, probably in her 70s. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm Elizabeth Donovan. I've been following your work from afar and finally found the courage to come in person." Something in her manner suggested she had a personal connection to our mission rather than professional interest. "I'm glad you did," I replied. "Please call me Ellie." "My husband died last year," she continued, her voice steady despite the difficulty of the subject. "In the process of settling his estate, I discovered he had been maintaining separate accounts for over a decade, accounts that funded another life entirely." The familiar pattern emerged as she shared her story: gradual exclusion from financial decisions, subtle undermining of her confidence in managing money, discovery of deception only after death made confrontation impossible. Her experience echoed elements of all our founding stories, particularly the isolation that had allowed exploitation to continue undetected. "I read about the Institute in a magazine," Elizabeth explained. "Recognized my own experience in the patterns you described. It was..." She paused, searching for the right words. "It was like suddenly having light in a room where I'd been stumbling in darkness. Understanding that it wasn't just me, that there were reasons it happened and ways to recover. This was the essence of our work, illuminating patterns that allowed women to recognize their experiences not as personal failings, but as manifestations of systemic vulnerabilities. Knowledge that transformed isolation into connection and shame into righteous determination." "Your recovery resources have been invaluable," Elizabeth continued. "But I wanted to do more than just rebuild my own security. I've been considering how to contribute to preventing this from happening to others. As we discussed possibilities, volunteer, roles, community education, policy advocacy, I recognized in Elizabeth the same transformation I had experienced months earlier. The evolution from victim-seeking recovery to advocate creating protection. The alchemy that transformed betrayal's leaden weight into the gold of purposeful action. Night had fallen completely by the time the celebration concluded, stars emerging above the farmhouse that had become both sanctuary and headquarters for our expanding mission. As the last guests departed and staff began clearing the grounds, I found myself drawn to Vivian's garden, now illuminated by subtle landscape lighting that enhanced its natural beauty. Settling onto a bench beneath the maple trees, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. The betrayal that had initially seemed like an ending had become instead a beginning, not just for me, but for hundreds of women who, had found their way to the Institute and thousands more who would benefit from the protections we were helping establish. Rick had intended to diminish my future, using our retirement savings to fund a different life while leaving me vulnerable in my later years. Instead, his actions had inadvertently connected me to purpose that transcended any retirement I had previously imagined and to community forged in shared resilience rather than social convention. The pain of betrayal remained a fact of my history, neither forgotten nor defining, but transformed from devastating conclusion into generative beginning. The trust that had been broken had been replaced not with cynicism, but with more authentic connections grounded in genuine understanding and shared purpose. As autumn leaves began their transformation on the maple trees above me, I considered how completely my understanding of security had evolved. No longer defined primarily by financial assets, security now encompassed purpose, community, and the knowledge that what had been built from betrayal would continue to protect others long after my personal experience had faded into history. On the one-year anniversary of that crisp autumn evening when I had overheard Rick's damning phone call, I stood at the podium in the Senate gallery, watching as the final vote tally appeared on the chamber's electronic board. The Federal Financial Protection Act had passed with a comfortable margin, establishing nationwide standards for retirement account protection, enhanced fraud detection systems, and mandatory training for financial professionals. Senator Wallace caught my eye from the floor, offering a subtle thumbs up that acknowledged our shared journey from state-level initiative to federal legislation. The provisions of the act incorporated key elements from the Institute's recommendations, evidence-based, protections developed from our extensive documentation of exploitation patterns and effective interventions. As we departed the Capitol, Helen, Diane, Patricia, and I paused on the steps for a moment of reflection. The legislative victory represented culmination of one phase of our work and commencement of another. Implementation would require continued advocacy, monitoring, and refinement, ensuring that protections existed not just in statute but in practice. I never imagined standing here, Patricia mused, gazing across the National Mall where autumn colors mirrored those at home in Michigan. When Jeffrey took my pension, I thought my life was essentially over. Now. She didn't need to complete the thought. We all understood the transformation she was describing, the journey from devastation to purpose that had characterized each of our experiences. The betrayals that had initially seemed to diminish our futures had instead connected us to work, more meaningful than any we had previously known. That evening, gathered in my suite at the Washington Hotel, we toasted not just the legislative victory, but the deeper triumph it represented, the transformation of individual pain into collective protection. What had begun in isolation and shame had evolved into public policy that would safeguard millions of women we would never meet. To Vivian, I proposed, raising my glass in honor of the woman whose foresight had not only protected me from financial devastation but had established the foundation for all we had built. She understood that true security comes not from avoiding betrayal, but from creating systems that limit its power to destroy. As we prepared to return to Michigan the following day, I found myself drawn to the hotel balcony where the illuminated monuments of Washington created a landscape of light against the night sky. These symbols of enduring principles seemed particularly fitting as backdrop to our work, the transformation of personal experience into lasting protection for others. My phone chimed with a message from Caroline Winters, the woman whose tentative inquiry at a workshop months earlier had led to discovery and recovery of her own financial security. Just saw the news about the act passing. Thank you for helping me find my voice. Starting volunteer training at the Institute next week. This message, one of dozens arriving as news of the legislation spread, captured the essence of our work. Not just helping women after exploitation occurred, but empowering them to transform their experiences into protection for others. The cycle of betrayal, recovery, and prevention continuing with each new woman who found her way from isolation into community. The next morning, boarding our flight home, I found myself seated beside an elderly woman who noticed the newspaper headline about the newly passed legislation. "That's going to help a lot of people," she remarked conversationally. "My sister lost everything to a second husband who convinced her to put all her assets in his name. By the time she realized what was happening, it was too late." I nodded, hearing yet another variation of the pattern we had documented so extensively. "It's unfortunately common," I acknowledged. "But there are resources available now for women in similar situations." "Are there?" she asked, interest kindling in her expression. "What kind of resources?" As the plane lifted into cloud-streaked skies, I explained the Institute's work, watching recognition and hope transform her expression. Another connection made, another isolation potentially broken, the work continuing, conversation by conversation, relationship by relationship, protection by protection. Rick had tried to diminish my future by draining our retirement. Instead, he had inadvertently set me on a path toward something far more valuable than the money he had taken: purpose, community, and the chance to ensure that financial betrayal would become increasingly difficult for men like him to accomplish. For the first time since discovering his deception, I felt genuine gratitude, not for the betrayal itself, which remained an unforgivable breach of trust, but for the unexpected path it had opened. The opportunity to transform personal devastation into meaningful protection for others. The discovery that endings sometimes conceal beginnings more significant than we could have imagined. As our plane descended toward Michigan, autumn colors, spreading below us like nature's own transformation on display, I thought of all the women who would find their way to the Institute in coming months and years. Women who would arrive in various states of financial and emotional distress, believing their futures diminished by betrayal. Women who would discover, as we had, that devastation need not be the end of the story. They would learn what we had. Learned that security comes not just from financial assets, but from knowledge, community, and purpose. That the most meaningful response to betrayal is not just personal recovery, but creation of protection that extends beyond oneself. That sometimes the greatest gifts arrive disguised as losses, revealing strengths and possibilities we might never otherwise have discovered. This understanding, hard-won through experience but increasingly embedded in both personal wisdom and public policy, would be Vivian's most enduring legacy. The knowledge that true security lies not in what we prevent from being taken, but in what we commit ourselves to building in its place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.